So welcome everyone out there in Zoom land. I'm Margaret Palmer, Director of SESYNC, and I just want to welcome you today to the seminar. I would ask that as you join, each of you introduces yourself in the chat box, indicating your name, where you are, a university or country, whatever you want to do, and your topic. This is a great networking opportunity, and oftentimes people hook up with one another after the seminars are over. I'm going to turn over things now to our host for this, our host for Dr. Schell, and this is Ryan Unks, Dr. Ryan Unks. He'll take over. I will say, as we go through the talk, if you think of questions, please enter them in the Q&A bubble down at the bottom of your screen as you think of them, and then Ryan will go through the Q&A at the end and ask Dr. Schell if he would like to address some of those. So again, welcome, and now Ryan, I hand it to you.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. Hi, everyone. I am Ryan Unks, postdoctoral fellow here at SESYNC in my second year, and I'm honored to introduce Dr. Schell to you all today. Dr. Schell is an assistant professor at UC Berkeley and was previously an assistant professor at the University of Washington, Tacoma, after completing postdoctoral study at Colorado State University. He completed his PhD in evolutionary biology at the University of Chicago following his undergraduate studies at Columbia, which focused on both psychology as well as ecology, evolution, and environmental biology. His work is rooted in behavioral endocrinology and an eco-evolutionary perspective within urban ecology. But recently, he and his co-authors have written a series of what I consider must-read papers that have fluidly incorporated social science perspectives into that eco-evolutionary perspective in urban ecology. And this work has gone far beyond merely integrating different perspectives. It is centered a sincerely interdisciplinary approach that is rarely seen in STEM, and that focuses on how deep understandings of historical, social, political, and economic processes are absolutely vital to consider, but also need to be at the core how we think about and study ecological processes. This work, while focused on urban ecology, has implications beyond the urban as well. And so I think is really important for our thinking beyond the urban for how we think about evolution and ecology. And he has also done a range of work seeking to amplify Black excellence in academia and highlighting the long, often underappreciated legacy of Black intellectuals that have made and continue to make foundational contributions, but who have often been minoritized by dominant narratives within academia. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Schell. And as Margaret mentioned, also please add your questions to the Q&A as the talk goes along.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan, for the introduction. And also thank you all for introducing yourselves in the chat. I see a lot of familiar names of folks that I've read your work, but I haven't gotten a chance to meet you in person or, I guess in the virtual Zoom-verse. So for sure, it's great to meet you all. Really excited today to share with you a smattering of the work that we do in my lab and how we tie conflicts, so human and wildlife conflicts, specifically with carnivores like coyotes, how we understand legacies of racism, classism, and oppression, and how that influences both the built landscape as well as social perceptions of these animals. And what does that all mean for the biology of our cities, for the biology outside of our cities, and for a world that is increasingly becoming more and more human dominated. So these are questions we need to have over and over and over again in order to create these syntheses that understand, well, as the world changes due to the climate crisis, due to increased urbanization, due to things that offshoot from both of those, like wildfires or floods, right, or major storms, non-human organisms are going to come into conflict with people. So how do we essentially use the tools that we have at our disposal to mitigate those impacts? So I've titled today's talk, Coyotes, Conflict, and Cities, Exploring the Role of Social Heterogeneity in Shaping Coyote Behavior. And I can imagine, right, because I'm talking to SESYNC, y'all already know this. So quite a bit of this is going to be work you've been working on or you've been thinking about quite a bit. But I'll just start us off with this premise that I, again, think all of us ascribe to, that social inequality is an ecological issue. And by saying it as such, it allows us to understand how social inequality and those injustices therein not only shape the social landscape that we see, but also the natural landscape. And there's no better way to start that journey than to start with this handsome Adonis right here, Jeff Goldblum, who in the original Jurassic Park movie, which I am positive y'all have seen it by now, but if you haven't, you have homework, right? Tonight, go watch Jurassic Park, or even better yet, Jeff Goldblum has a new show on Disney Plus that is just to die for. But in the movie, he has this entire monologue about life finding a way, right? Super famous line. One of my postdocs, for instance, has their thesis titled after this line, because in the movie, it's an allusion to dinosaurs finding their way out of these man-made enclosures and really figuring out a way to survive. Well, indeed, in cities, life is finding a way, so much so that in cities across the globe, we are seeing organisms develop behavioral, physiological, or otherwise strategies to survive and in some instances thrive in urban ecosystems, from say urban smooth-coated otters here in Singapore to raccoons in the Pacific Northwest and everything in between. These organisms are developing strategies that allow them to successfully cope, so much so that new literature is coming out to describe how environmental variation driven by these cities, driven principally by people, say changes in temperature, changes in light regimes, or maybe food subsidies, or the spatial or temporal kind of location of pollutants, is changing the individual variation that we see across urban populations relative to their non-urban conspecifics. That piece is important because natural selection 101, right? You need variation to be able to select on in order for you to see variable fitness consequences. And that's exactly what we're seeing in a multitude of studies that are coming out under the subdiscipline, but emerging rapidly, urban evolutionary biology, where these principally human-dominated features are shaping the consequences for organisms in cities that allow us to build more frameworks to understand what that looks like. For us in the Schell lab, we think pretty closely about these issues for these cute and cuddly creatures, right? Charismatic megafauna that always wins the day. And there is no real excuse. I would not be bringing my A game if I didn't show y'all some videos of the cute and cuddly. So these videos have been, it should be noted, taken by many of our community partners and then sent to us as a lab in order to share with the rest of the community. So the video on the left that y'all see of your screen of raccoons are raccoons in a parking lot in Tacoma. So near central Tacoma, which is pretty urbanized, right? And they're just figuring out their way. This was around about 1 p.m. in the afternoon. They're just doing their thing. They really don't care if people are around. Whereas here on the right, what y'all see are some coyote puppies that are emerging from their den. And you may notice, oh, wait, that looks like a house. Yes, indeed, this was a video sent to us by some of our community partners and volunteers in Denver, Colorado. So one of the coyote moms created a den underneath this house. And the puppies are just like chilling. This is their home, right? You can also see lights of other houses in the background. So we study these animals quite a bit, not just in these non-urban spaces, but also in these urban spaces where they're making it work. As you saw the raccoons coming over the fence, or these coyotes denning underneath the house, they are making it work. Just to share a couple of other examples that I think are very noteworthy that got me into studying urban carnivores, but really provide a set of case studies to truly understand how adaptable these animals are. The one in the top left, some of y'all may have heard, right? We were talking before the talk about Chicago and how cold it is. Well, Chicago can also get kind of hot, right? Kind of humid. This photo up here in the top left of a coyote sleeping in a drink cooler is one of a coyote 2008 during the summer, walked into a Quiznos on State Street. For those of y'all that know or from Chicago, you know State Street, downtown Chicago. That's Chicago. That's downtown Chicago. This animal, no fear, super brazen, walked into a Quiznos, hopped in, fell asleep, stayed there for 45 minutes till animal control came to relocate it, right? This animal in the top right is of an animal on the train in Portland. Rode a couple of stops before it was escorted off the train. And it clearly looks like it belongs. It's looking at the person whoever took this photo and said, sorry, this is my seat. One of my favorites is this coyote down in the bottom left. This was Pizza Coyote. So in Huntington Beach, California, almost every other week, this coyote would come to a local pizza establishment and just get slices of pizza, just like that, super easy. All of these examples highlight what happens when these animals get too habituated, too tolerant of people, maybe expecting food subsidies, where we start to see increases in the number of human-coyote conflicts, which oftentimes means that coyotes are too close to people, they may be following too close, right? In many instances, perceptions of the animals, we like to call it the big bad wolf hypothesis. So folks will see coyotes, envision them bigger as what they actually are. They're not that big. And then say, well, this animal is threatening me. We have that happening, for instance, in San Jose, near a senior living community, where the folks there are saying, we don't want coyotes in our town, our neighborhood at all. Pets and food tend to be some of the largest predictors of when that conflict happens. So this is all important because what I've been trying to highlight in these last few slides is that people are integral to this equation. We are the humans and the directors of this screenplay. I like to joke that we're the Lin-Manuel Miranda of this joint. Not only did we cast all the cast members, we compose all the songs, we even put together the rotating stage, right? We also are acting in this play. We also are seeing it as it unfolds in real time, which should be noted when we talk about human-wildlife or human-carnivore conflict. It very much breaks down to the simple equation, or at least I've simplified it for y'all, of how behavior of the animals adapting to human-dominated environments because of landscape changes driven by people paired with human drivers equals conflict. So these animals are finding ways to survive, and yet sometimes those ways do in fact jut up against what people perceive should be happening, or whether or not they perceive some level of threat from those animals being in the environment. We can model that by trying to understand how animals interact with people, say on differences in urban scale, from the household to the entirety of a city, on different ecological levels, from say the individual or organismal, all the way up to the population level, and how predictable the potential interactions may be, from highly predictable to very, very unpredictable. And it should be noted that as we create this model, it helps us to try and understand how our perceptions of wildlife influencing the way in which we treat those animals. So some of the new streams of research that we're putting together, headed up by one of my postdocs, Christine Wilkinson, as well as Lauren Stanton, another postdoc in the lab, is trying to understand if social perceptions have any biological consequences to how these animals are adapting to cities. And that then means that we have to partition the varied influences by which people are influencing these biological systems, because it's not all the same, right? Not all interactions are created equal. Some are direct, some are indirect. And just as the title of this talk implies, they are very heterogeneous across that urban landscape. So most likely y'all already know and have thought about this quite a bit, but human presence is very much one of the top of mind issues that we think about when we say, how is human activity influencing wildlife? And that encompasses all the direct human-animal interactions that exist. For instance, like this photo of this person sharing food with this squirrel at, getting dapper, high five, something like that, right? Probably the second most, or the 1B answer that most people think about, is human footprint. So that's the indirect effects that are experienced by organisms from the built environment. So think impervious surface cover, like concrete, building densities, the way in which the landscape is fundamentally different from those non-urban landscapes, and how that influences things like refugia, community level interactions, novel species interactions, disease dynamics, and the like. These two, human presence, human footprint, we oftentimes say, okay, those are the most important pieces if we want to fully understand how people are influencing wildlife. But in the last few years, recent evidence and an emergence of new theory has also started to incorporate human attitudes right? So how do differences in human attitudes towards wildlife shape how we interact with those organisms? So not all peoples, for instance, will interact the same way as this person did with this squirrel. Same thing with, say, a mountain lion, right? We can go the full spectrum. Some folks will interact with the mountain lion very differently than others. And in certain instances, there are social norms about how you interact with those organisms, but those social norms are broken. Why are they broken? How are they broken? And what are the predictors that allow us to understand those changes? Should be noted, as is clear to, again, most of y'all, all of these intersect with each other. So human presence is more likely to be a thing in certain parts of the city, right, where the footprint is large. And certain attitudes are likely to be more pervasive in certain parts of the city. What we're already seeing anecdotally from some of the data that we've been collecting through participatory research, survey, and animal movement is that most folks in wealthier neighborhoods tend to believe that wild carnivores should not be in their environment. Yet we know that wealthier neighborhoods tend to have greater green space. So they are more likely to have the ecological complexity necessary to sustain carnivore populations. And yet the people that exist in those spaces don't want them there. So that's conflict right there in a nutshell, right? Human interactions rather than human wildlife interactions. But before we dig too deep, I think it's important to, one, have a little bit of a Marvel Cinematic Universe stop here, because I'm a huge fan of all things Marvel, but I think it's apropos for this particular example. What I want y'all to do is just take a step back for a little bit, right? Let's slow it in. Let's not get too complex into the models. Let's think about trees. Something as simple as trees, which I think I saw Morgan Grove on here. So Morgan, we'll be talking about some of your work as well. But I want y'all to just think, be Groot. We all will be Groot for a little bit as I show you a side-by-side comparison of two neighborhoods in Tacoma that are no more than a half mile apart from each other, okay? So what I want you to do is think like the trees, be Groot. All right, so these two neighborhoods, these two aerial photos are of, on the left, University Place, and on the right, Southeast Tacoma. Now, University Place on the left here is a township right up against the southwestern part of downtown Tacoma. I think it had a golf tournament at one point. I'm not sure if it was what champion series it was. Doesn't really matter. Green space, right? Photo on the right, Southeast Tacoma, is as it sounds, southeast of downtown Tacoma. Now, again, these neighborhoods are no more than a half mile apart from each other. So if I were, and these questions are rhetorical, but just think about them for yourself in your head. If I were to ask you, all right, y'all, which of these two neighborhoods would you expect to have a greater percentage of vegetation cover? You wouldn't flinch. If you're being Groot, or really just any living organism, you could easily say, well, Chris, dude, it's University Place. It clearly has more green space. I mean, in certain areas, it has an entire lots of intact green space, right? I'm like, okay, that one's easy. If I follow up and then ask you the question, of these two neighborhoods, which would you expect to have a higher median household income? You probably also wouldn't flinch. If you've grown up in a city, really anywhere in the US, or in some instances, anywhere in the globe, you will have this intrinsic knowledge that cities or townships or neighborhoods that have greater vegetation cover relative to other neighborhoods and higher median household income, that positive relationship between socioeconomic wealth and plant productivity, right? That has a name. It's called the luxury effect. So this luxury effect hypothesis essentially states that species richness, so the number of species, and biodiversity, the relative abundance of those species in space, are positively associated with socioeconomic wealth. Now, mind you, we will start to disentangle how this is not the case for every example in every city, and we'll get into why that is the case and why we need to dig a little bit deeper. But for those of you where this is the first time that you've heard of the luxury effect hypothesis, I've done you a solid. Here are some studies that show how wealth structures ecological communities worldwide across many different trophic levels, from primary producers all the way up to tertiary consumers. And it's not just, say, the number of species, but also how abundant they are, overall diversity, right? How likely they are to colonize different habitats as a function of socioeconomic wealth. You may notice that arthropods and mammals are a little lean. I'm a mammologist, so that's one of the things that we've done recently as a larger group, the Urban Wildlife Information Network, or UN, as well as in collaboration, the Grit City Carnivore Project. We came together using these urban to rural transects and placed cameras on those transects and trying to understand, are socioeconomic gradients across cities linked to coyote and urban wildlife occupancy, right? So really simply, we just drew an imaginary line on, say, city grounds from urban downtown areas outside of the city and said, can we map spatially whether or not there are any differences in how animals occupy space as a function of socioeconomic wealth? What's different here for this study relative to other studies, however, is that we didn't decide to just do it once for one city, because that had been done quite a bit before, showing relationships that, and y'all will know this, right? You do a study in one area, one city, one habitat, it may not even be urban, and then make a conclusion, and somebody else does the exact same study in a different setting, different city, different non-urban setting, doesn't really matter, right? But y'all are asking the same question, you get very different responses. And we inherently said, well, what if we were to ask the same question at the same time, using the same methods for a bunch of cities? So the Urban Wildlife Information Network, which is this collaboration of urban wildlife officials, whether it be professionals in the academy, those at cultural institutions like zoos or museums, practitioners, all came together in these different cities. And yes, transects look a little different for different cities, but to be expected, right? The overall kind of gist of this was to try and understand how changes occur on an urbanization gradient. So for this recent paper that we worked on in Global Change Ecology, we took about 20 of the 35 cities that are in the UN network. And from 2013 to 2019, collated all of that data together and approximated human footprint, i.e. our urbanization metric, by taking together impervious surface cover, building densities, and vegetation cover, which we often do in many of our UN studies, and collapse them down into one principal component. That allows us to then just look at urbanization generally compared to income, median household income. And we were able to use cost of a one-bedroom apartment here as a proxy that would allow us to be as inclusive as possible. Because in many parts of the city where we were putting cameras, it's mostly apartment complexes, not always single-family homes. So in order for us to fully grasp and comprehend what's happening in all of our cities, we use cost of a one-bedroom apartment as our proxy for median household income. And then briefly use the Bayesian occupancy model to determine whether or not there were, say, any relationships within cities and among cities generally to understand, all right, are we seeing any influences of income? So what I'm going to show you here today is mostly the results that we had for income as a function of how is it influencing species richness, and then show you kind of species by species comparisons. So what did we find for species generally? The number of species we are able to detect in relation to these income gradients. Well, it varies by city. So that's a fancy way of me saying that it depends, right? It depends on what city you're in, where in some instances, let me orient you a little bit to this figure. What you see here on the x-axis is the correlation between species richness and a city's income gradient. So this dashed line right here essentially means that there's a neutral effect. So if this normal distribution is overlaying this line, that means really there's no relationship between the income gradient that we see in the city and the number of species we're able to detect across that city. Whereas if, say, the normal distribution is to the left of the line, that means there's this negative relationship, opposite of what we would have predicted. So as income increases, species richness decreases. And in positive relationships, so above the line is exactly what we would predict, right? So more species means likely more wealth in the environment. And for some cities, that luxury effect tends to hold. So think St. Louis, Seattle, Jackson, Mississippi, Phoenix, Arizona, and Rochester, New York, right? The top 5 cities these cities do tend to have those positive relationships. But as you start to slide down here, you start to notice, it's looking a little funny. It's not the same for all cities, right? Right around Wilmington, Delaware is where we start to see more neutral relationships. Probably makes quite a bit of sense, right? We started this talk off talking about social heterogeneity and landscape heterogeneity, which that heterogeneity is certainly the case for species as well. So it should be noted that there is no broad sweeping evidence across cities to suggest income or urbanization shape specifically coyote colonization and movement. And here what you're seeing is a plot of response to income by species and a response to urbanization. Again, these are the posterior estimates taken from that Bayesian occupancy model, where positive relationship here on the right side of the dashed line means that the wealthier a neighborhood is, the more likely you are to see that species there. Whereas a negative relationship, not so much. So let's just skip ahead for income. Let's save that for a little bit. Let's go over to urbanization. And what you see is this really strong effect for ungulates, where for urbanization, the more urbanized it is, white-tailed deer, moose, mule deer, they don't want to be anywhere near those parts of the city. They want to be in areas that have more green space. It's kind of the same thing a little bit for bobcats and cougars as well, right? But if you were to look at income for those same species, it's not entirely clear. And again, each of these circles represents a sampled city. So for some cities, yeah, sure, white-tailed deer, they are negatively responding to income. But for other cities, they're positively responding to income. So income alone, right? Just by this alone, and if we were to draw out coyotes, same thing. Some cities, negative relationship. Some cities, positive relationship. Meaning that something other than just income alone is predicting where these animals are going to be. And understanding that means that we have to decompose quite a bit more than just how much money people make inside of a city. It may also mean that we have to also understand how these legacies of, say, economic inequality influence not just the biological components of the cities, but also the abiotic components of those cities as well. So I like to joke that this is the Avatar Last Airbender section of the talk. And yeah, I know for those of y'all that are fans, I stretched that analogy a little bit with earthbending, right? So we talked about all the living stuff, but there are effects on clean water as well, right? So those that are from low income communities oftentimes have poor access to clean water or air pollution, right? So air pollution, and specifically measured by PM 2.5, particulate matter, that's what the PM stands for. 2.5 is just the diameter of the particle, and now it's moving through space and time. That is greater in low income areas as well. And urban heat islands, likely at this point, y'all have heard quite a bit, whether it be coverage through Vox or NPR or some other source, that urban heat islands, this effect where inside of cities relative to outside of cities, they tend to be anywhere from 3 to 10 degrees hotter. Well, in certain parts of the city, because there are less trees, less green space, less vegetation cover, that reduces the amount of, say, cooling, environmental cooling that happens in those neighborhoods. So certain impoverished neighborhoods have higher urban heat island effects. So it should be noted at the beginning of the segment of the talk, I prepared y'all by saying that this luxury effect is cool, but it doesn't explain everything. And one of the recent meta-analyses that came out by Canis et al. In Landscape and Urban Planning took a look at that point in time, right? All of the papers that were published on the luxury effect, separated them by flora and fauna, and then looked at how land use consideration, so residential to non-residential, as well as how dense the city was packed, influences whether or not the outcome was positive, like we would predict, higher socioeconomic status, higher species richness and biodiversity, neutral, where there was no effect at all, and negative, the opposite relationship. And yeah, certainly in residential areas, the majority of studies tend to find positive relationships. But in mixed and non-residential, it's not as clear cut, right? And if you look at, say, dense versus sparse, think New York versus Los Angeles, again, not clear cut. It's not always the case where you find a positive relationship. which means that we need to dig deeper. Our story is incomplete if we don't consider all components of the city and why we have economic inequality in the first place, right? And that means we have to dig into structural racism and classism, how the legacies of oppression and inequality generate these different landscape heterogeneities. So how things like residential segregation, differential resource allocation, gentrification, political representation, all of which are influenced by systemic biases, influences where the impervious surfaces are, which influences how hot it gets in certain parts of the city, which influences or is influenced by green space and tree cover, right? Which environmental pollutants, resource distribution, disease dynamics, y'all get it, right? All of these layers all coalesce together to influence the eco-evil processes in cities they're in. So if we fully want to be urban ecologists and understand the way in which the city operates biologically, if we don't look at the social structures that exist in our cities and the way in which the concrete was founded, right? How either land was stolen, changed, repurposed, refurbished, polluted, contaminated. We need to understand those legacies in order to fully grasp the eco-evil processes that happen as a function of human-dominated environments. And this obviously needed to happen like yesterday because of the fact that we are facing multiple crises, right? We're facing a war on three fronts, not only systemic racism, but the climate crisis, as well as everything that flows from that. So one of perhaps the most tangible examples for folks to see how social and ecological dynamics play a role very closely in most of our US cities is through redlining, this policy that was enacted from the 30s to the 60s that essentially stated where you could live based off of the color of your skin. So redlining was a systematic denial of services, housing, or otherwise in certain neighborhoods. So these green and blue areas, A and B respectively, were designated for wealthy white Americans. So many of these areas still today are some of the most affluent areas in, say, Oakland, right? So this is the Oakland, Berkeley, Piedmont area. Piedmont is still incredibly wealthy, incredibly white, with a bunch of McMansions everywhere. Whereas these yellow and red areas, deemed C and D respectively, were predominantly for folks that were low income or people of color. They would oftentimes be deemed undesirable or unfit to live in. And that was for a ton of reasons. Some of the major ones being that much of the green space was taken out for row homes to be put in or housing developments to be put in. These areas were often proximal to many, say, waste management sites or pollutant sites or dumping areas. To this day, in many of these instances, these areas still are. So if this is the first time you've heard of redlining, I got two resources for you. The first being The Color of Law, written by Richard Rothstein. Great book, provides a very comprehensive history behind redlining. The second being the Mapping Inequality project that is hosted by the University of Richmond. Should be noted, if you grew up anywhere in a city in the United States, any city, likely your city was redlined. I couldn't even fit all of the cities on here. Started with 61 and I ended with 108 purposefully because I wanted to show you all the cities that I do my work in, right? That we do our work in as a lab: Tacoma, Seattle, Oakland, and San Francisco. And notice how these different cities, though they are all redlined, are shaped very, very differently. So if I'm a coyote navigating this landscape, thinking about how people are perceiving me, but also where are the greatest distribution of resources, the greatest amount of refugia to hide from people if they are kind of persecuting me, right? The way in which I move through Tacoma may be very different from the way in which I move through San Francisco, Oakland, and Seattle. And that's not going to only have influences on the behavior of these animals, but also likely on the endocrine function of those animals, on the immune function of those animals. We know that contemporary maps, for instance, created by Cal EnviroScreen or the Washington Department of Health, show how differences in health disparities map on real close to these redlining maps as well. So this allows us to fully understand the biology of these cities, and it should be noted that this work is already being done. So Locke and Company in 2021, which now it's in PJ, right, NJP, but was previously a preprint. I always refer to this paper because it is extraordinary at showing how tree canopy cover across 37 of those redlined cities still to this day are showing greater tree canopy cover in these green, and in some instances, these blue areas relative to these yellow and red areas. Again, A and B reserved for wealthy white Americans, C and D for low-income Americans and persons of color. Just to hold for a second to think about that, y'all, like redlining was abolished in 1968. That was more than 50 years ago. And we're still seeing the effects, right? The trees essentially are telling their stories like Groot, that they are showing the legacies in real time of what's happening. So again, imagine if you're a coyote or a bird of any sort, you are thinking about where you're able to survive and in some instances thrive in cities. So I could put coyotes hypothetically anywhere on this map in San Francisco, and we can make predictions based off of where they are in ecospace. We also know from a lot of behavioral ecology and wildlife ecology work with coyotes that they condense their home ranges inside of cities. So areas that seem small, normally for a non-urban conspecific, may be just what they need, but that also means that this individual organism or this individual organism has a very different reality compared to the one that's closest to Golden Gate Park. So we can say, you know, plant, biota, and prey resources are limited in red and yellow areas, or at the very least, they're very different. So do animals compensate by eating more anthropogenic foods in those environments? Right? Are there greater genetic bottlenecks and limited gene flow as a function of reduced green space in those areas? Should also be noted, these coyotes are highly territorial. So if any of these other individuals try and even remotely step foot into Golden Gate, they're probably going to get their butts kicked. So that means that not only do you have the urban landscape reinforcing those boundaries, but you have social hierarchies reinforcing those boundaries as well. So you have stress on either side. Probably the stress physiology of these animals look quite a bit different than these. So we can build predictions. Is there greater physiological stress? Are the animals bolder because they have to be? Because they experience more people here because they can't escape them? Are there higher turnover rates because of that higher stress, right? These are all questions that we as a lab are starting to address right now and unpack in the Bay Area. With behavior being the linchpin. Because the animals tell us a lot, even without nonverbal communication, tell us quite a bit about how they are moving and perceiving the landscape, by how they navigate that landscape through GPS collaring, cameras, or the like. Just to show you what some of that data looks like, right? Here on the left is a video of an in-cage test that we do with the animals. So once we capture the animals, we do a couple of, say, behavioral batteries to understand how those animals respond specifically to people. So this video, what you'll see is I quickly remove the blanket that's on top of the animal, right? And some of the tests that we do is we back up a little bit by about 10 feet, and then we charge the animal and see how they respond to us. We clap in front of the animal and see if they make any noises. We also walk around the cage. So that's me just recording what the animal is doing on this ethogram to see how they perform. Ultimately, what you'll see is like, I will chase this animal and they will do something very coyote characteristic when they are pissed. Right? So he's just looking at me like, okay, when do I get out of this cage? I step back 10 feet, charge the animal. Let me make sure y'all can hear that. I'm sharing my computer sound right now. Oh, maybe, no. You'll just have to believe me that the sound is extraordinary. So you see that the animal is making quite a bit of just like movements with its head. Of course, because I knew I was going to do this. It's going to be on a recording. It's making a sound like. There you go. That's my coyote visualization for the day. So not all animals do this, right? This is a threat call. Like if you come closer to me, we're going to have problems. Let me back up and see if I can. Okay. Some of the other tests we're doing are slightly more non-invasive. So here what you're seeing is a video, or at least just a still image. The video's not playing, but it doesn't matter, right? Of a novel object that we have in the field where we put stakes in the ground and tie string around it. Seems very simple, right? But in habitat space where these animals are not expecting to see anything like this, we put lure, so just meat, essentially, we call it sweet meat, inside of this enclosure and see how the animals respond and whether or not they are more or less reluctant to move into this novel object space to get a resource reward. Now, the hope is that if we were to do all of these tests across the landscape within a city, we may be able to see some differences, but that data is forthcoming. Okay, so hopefully at this point, I have convinced you that social inequality is an ecological issue. I probably didn't need to convince you too much because you probably came to this talk because you knew it was up, right? And by that same token, then environmental justice and anti-racism are perhaps the most potent forms of urban conservation and sustainability that we have to date. And that means if we lead with environmental justice and anti-racism, then we can begin the process of deconstructing systems of oppression, reconciling past ills, and mobilizing our community to really value all forms of knowledge. Should be noted, I am providing this seminar today, but many of these conversations, these threads, these themes have been resounding for decades, even before I was born, where civil rights are essentially the prerequisite, right? Or environmental health is the prerequisite to civil rights and vice versa. And that leads into some of the work that we've been doing inside of the academy. Some of y'all aren't urban ecologists. Some of y'all, mostly you do your work just in the lab. And you're thinking, all right, Chris, like, what does this mean for me? I don't work in cities. I work in really remote places. I only work in the lab. Well, we got a lot of work to do at home, right? I mean, structural changes in the short and the long term. Everything from making justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion sessions at conferences the main event, not just a side event that's scheduled during another desirable, say, opportunity or workshop, making it front and center, practicing anti-racist strategies everywhere and not cherry picking, right? And stating it as a class that everybody takes, that is required. For instance, we have that in ESPM, where we have our anti-racism course that both faculty and graduate students take during their first few years here at the university. And that also means amplifying Black excellence, right? Citing Black authors and scholars, making sure that they're compensated equitably for the work that they do, celebrating that engagement, maybe even changing the structure in which we evaluate folks using tenure. One of my good friends and colleagues, Dr. Naima Harris, and I have talked quite a bit about how we value species richness and biodiversity in ecosystems, but in the academy, we oftentimes talk about how we all need to be monoculture and all relatively doing the same thing, right? Publish or perish. That doesn't really help for a dynamic ecosystem that's going to live on and on and on. If anything, it's going to go extinct sooner rather than later. So thinking about how we value heterogeneity, even in the work that we do and the personalities that we bring to the table and being our full selves, is just as important as doing the work with our non-human biological systems. And that also means decolonizing ecology. How do we validate multiple forms of knowledge, multiple forms of knowing, so then that way we can build better, more comprehensive stories and narratives that fully tell the entire perspective of the work that we're doing. So that means things from decolonizing our mind, right? Individual work, to how do we decolonize expertise and practice doing our work in inclusive teams. And it should be noted, right, as one of the end slides, I always like to give a shout out to say that it seems like there are more Black scholars now than there have been, but really it's also about visibility. And I want to make sure that on this recorded SESYNC talk, that visibility of Black scholars is really front and center. And I wish I could show y'all multiple slides, because this is just slide one of like 5 decks of different slides of different scholars doing it. It should be noted, right? We're here. We're doing the work. And that work means trying to understand empirically how these animals are adapting to these human-dominated landscapes, but also really pushing forward what it means to be a scholar activist. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge a bunch of folks more that could be put on this page that have helped contribute to these syntheses, and there's a lot, right? From natural to the social sciences and back. There's quite a bit of work that goes into doing all of this. So I want to thank all of the contributors to this work. Thank all of y'all for coming to the talk, and we'll open up for any questions you may have.
Okay, great. Thanks for that very stimulating talk, Dr. Schell. So we have a few different questions in the chat. So Rachel Mason asked a question that you answered about how distinct are populations of animals in areas of a single city with different histories or human attitudes towards wildlife. And are we seeing evolution in different directions because of these factors? But she said that you had already answered that, from her perspective, but she was asking if you could add any other examples of
Yes.
that you've seen in your work. Great.
Yeah, so we have some collaborators in St. Louis that Kelly Lane DeGrasse specifically at Fontbonne University that has started to see evidence of within city divergence based off of socioeconomic status and wealth. So she's been looking at the genetics of raccoons and has shown that for those of you that are from or have been to St. Louis, there's this road called Delmar. It's oftentimes called the Delmar Divide because above and below the divide, there are two different cities. Above the divide is mostly low income. Below the divide is mostly high income. It's literally just one major street that separates the wealth in that city. And that major street also separates subpopulations of raccoons in the environment, where genetic diversity is greater in the wealthier neighborhood than it is in the low income neighborhood. So yes, there is some emerging evidence that is starting to demonstrate this genetic break. Whether or not that genetic break continues, and if it is, say, natural selection or more just neutral evolution, where you just see greater genetic bottlenecks in low income areas, that's still to be determined, right? So are we seeing selection? Are we seeing reduced gene flow? Are we seeing greater genetic bottlenecks? Are we seeing all of it? Are we seeing all of it? There may also be some reinforcement of sexual selection that happens in those areas, right? So as those animals start to diverge, their body condition is also changing pretty dramatically. In areas that are low income, they're eating more anthropogenic foods. So their body condition is more like a 4 or a 5 on a scale of 1 to 5, where 4 or 5 is bigger, right? Bigger, more portly animals. We're seeing that in some captive work we're doing with coyotes, where if you give them supplemental food, they automatically, just like after 2-3 weeks, are a lot heavier than they used to be. They don't move nearly as much either. So that may have quite a bit to do with the way in which their social structure is also shaped. But again, ongoing research, we have no idea what it's going to look like here in the future, but I bet a couple of years from now, we'll have some really exciting stuff.
Great, thanks. So we had a question from Margaret Palmer. Can the various drivers of animals acclimating to urban areas be teased apart to help inform management to minimize conflict?
Yes, that's the hope. And many of the drivers, at least that we have seen recently from many of the calls that we've got, feel like we need a bat signal at this point, or a coyote signal, is folks from the Bay Area will call us and say, like, hey, we have this problem with this animal. So one of the things that we're tasked with is trying to figure out what are those drivers or components that contribute to conflict, so that way we can help mitigate the conflict. And oftentimes the number 2 things, almost always, is somebody feeding the animals, or are there a lot of domestic pets that are either off leash or, say, outdoor cats. Should be noted, y'all probably already know this by now, if you have an outdoor cat, or if you have a cat generally, keep your cat indoors for a lot of reasons. I could go into it on and on about disease ecology and how outdoor cats are more likely to distribute toxoplasmosis across the landscape. Neither here nor there, right? They also depredate a lot of native birds and herps. That said, though, cats and coyotes vehemently against each other. If there are cats in the environment, coyotes will oftentimes come into conflict with those cats and take them out. When you have pet losses, that contributes quite substantially to the number of conflicts that we see. And that happens all throughout the Bay Area. Food and food subsidies is the other biggest piece. So we know the drivers. That's kind of me burying the lead a little bit. We know the drivers of human-wildlife conflicts. We know how to mitigate them. Here's the thing, though. We've tried that. And if y'all have cats, you know that there's 5% of cat people that if you do anything to the cat, you have hell raining down upon you. So that's what's happened with some of our manager partners, is that they were tasked with saving native species in marshlands and removed a couple of feral cats, but some of those feral cats were being fed by a woman in the neighborhood, caused a huge uproar that went national, and now they're under litigation. That's not the only time that that's happened. That's happened quite a bit in different areas, right? So understanding how we mitigate conflict in a nutshell just boils down to, how do we get folks to understand that you need to share the landscape with wildlife, and you will need to continually share that landscape. That piece may be beyond my pay grade. That's where we fully need to start talking to social scientists to understand what's the psychology of how we change people's environmental perspectives so they're able to live with the species. And that means we anthropomorphize our animals. We oftentimes give them names. So then that way the community feels more ownership of the data, but also feels more community with the animals around them.
Great, thanks for that. So on that note, where you kind of left off there, so this is my own question. So I've been very impressed with how you seamlessly weave ideas from social sciences all through your work on understanding how social factors shape ecological and evolutionary processes. And to me, you engage with social science in a way that's rather implied, but it's obvious to somebody who knows social science how you're using it in these ways. But that might not be so obvious to natural scientists, how you're using social science. And so I was just wondering, for someone with a traditional training in evolutionary biology, could you talk a little bit about how the process behind how you frame research problems and how the social sciences shape your research process? Maybe specifically thinking about how you reconcile different epistemologies, different ways of knowing in your work.
Right. Yeah, I mean, for me, it was a little bit of lived experience and a lot of networking. And the networking piece, that part is critical. So a lot of the work that we do, as Ryan had mentioned, I was academically raised as a behavioral biologist. So a lot of the work that I do is in community with social scientists quite a bit. Luckily, I landed in a department where that is a staple of our department. So we are environmental science, policy, and management, as broad as we can be. And we have a lot of folks that are social scientists, right? Like they're academically raised as social scientists. I think for me, the way that it started out was I was thinking about these issues quite a bit, just being born and raised in the city and being born and raised as a Black man in Los Angeles. So it's hard not to see those differences and dichotomies in cities. If y'all are familiar with LA, you'll know that certain parts of LA have a lot more concrete, have a lot more, say, row homes, right? Have a lot more housing developments relative to certain parts of Los Angeles that are these huge mansions, large green spaces, and it breaks down amongst racial lines quite a bit. So Black community in parts of Altadena or Compton or Inglewood, we grew up wishing we had more access to green space, but didn't always have that access. We knew that we'd have to drive somewhere in order to get to that access, right? And even when we did access that green space, we were perceived as not belonging in that area. So my upbringing in LA, knowing that some green spaces seem to intrinsically be for some people versus others, just always rubbed me the wrong way. And when I was doing work as an urban ecologist as a grad student, and saw how folks were also sampling different parts of the city, many of my contemporaries that were kind of at the fringes, like the cutting edge of urban ecology, would study parts of the city that weren't in parts of the city that were majority Black. And I had a problem with that because I knew Chicago, for instance, is in Hyde Park, which itself is a bubble and is problematic, but it's in the south side of Chicago. We knew there were coyotes in the south side of Chicago, but nobody was studying those coyotes. Everybody was on the north side, which is superbly affluent. So we can't fully understand what's happening with the city if we don't even sample across the entirety of the city. And that just constantly bugged me. But you academically, you're raised like, just focus on the science, and that was implicit kind of harmful code to say, just focus on the natural sciences. So I vowed that when I got in a position of power, that would change, because of the fact that what is happening in the city socially, the social fabric of the city, is part of our purview. We do need to think about that, but we also can't be stepping on toes, right? That's not how I normally do my work. So I say, well, how can I network with folks that do actually do this for a living? And it should be noted that science paper, right, is a mix of natural scientists and social scientists. Danica Patrick and Cleo Wolf Erskine, right? They were kind of raised in the social scientists, indigenous sciences realm. So they came with multiple ways of knowing, how do we integrate that for a paper in science? So it should be noted, like most of the papers we've been putting together are social ecological. We're trying to live what we preach, not just a bunch of biologists doing that work. But it took a minute, right? Like I said, from childhood. So it's been a long while of me thinking about these issues to then integrate them. And I try and put a little bit of my own experience in there, because positionality is important.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much for that. So, we have a few other questions. So in terms of the association between urban risk to pollutants, toxins, et cetera, and poverty/race, how did this evolve over time with regard to toxic industries first, and then minorities move there, or minority communities first, then toxic industries come?
Yeah, so if I understood that question correctly, it's really kind of getting at how do we understand maybe like the geographic location of toxins and how that is related to the geographic distribution of minority communities. Is that did I kind of get that right?
I think that was it.
Okay.
We
yeah,
actually, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
I was just going to say there was a follow-up question from Rachel Mason too on the previous question.
Sure.
We could go back to that. Sorry, it would have been better to go to it directly, but I just saw it now. Speaking of different ways of knowing, have you encountered any difficulties in figuring out who to listen to? I'm sure you've come across lay people who are super intelligent and observant and can tell you a lot about what's going on around them, and others who don't forget that description. Any thoughts about navigating that kind of thing, being humble and skeptical at the same time?
For sure. Yeah. So I'll start with the contaminants question and then move on to the multiple ways of knowing question. So with the contaminants question, luckily a lot of that work has been done for us. So there was a paper published by Tessim et al. In PNAS that looked at PM 2.5 exposure and controlled for differences in income gradients, and saw that even in cities like Los Angeles and Seattle and Chicago, even if you are more affluent and a person of color, you are more likely to experience a greater percentage of air pollutants relative to others. The same can be said for access to clean water, think Flint, Michigan, or access to different ecological habitats, right? Different habitat types. So when I say different habitat types in cities, one of my colleagues and friends, Travis Gallo, took a look at whether or not differences in habitat types also predicts ecological community composition. So think a playground with short mown grassland versus contiguous habitat that hasn't been, like old growth forest, for instance, or a golf course. All of them are different, all serve different purposes, all have different amounts of human activity at them. So the amounts of habitat types, the variability of habitat types also reduces in areas that are predominantly communities of color. And that hasn't changed in areas like Oakland either. So the flats of Oakland, which were predominantly, and unfortunately are changing, predominantly Black, but because of gentrification and homes that are 2-bed, 1-bathroom, 900 square feet are selling for $1.4 million. I kid you not, that is not hyperbole, I wish it was, right, is completely changing the landscape. But even still, we see that the proximal location of those pollutants is really honed in on low-income communities and minoritized communities. So hopefully that got a little bit to that question. So the second question, Rachel, about multiple ways of knowing, honestly, it helps us do our job, right? So say, for instance, camera traps. When we go to set up camera traps, and I've done a lot of work in mostly West Coast cities. Unfortunately, a lot of West Coast cities are dealing with housing security at extraordinary rates. But the unhoused are really good informants about what animals move through the landscape. And they are more likely to protect the camera if they know that you're in community with them. So we will oftentimes talk to folks that are unhoused, that are in the area, and ask them like, hey guys, is it okay that we put a camera here? We're only looking for wildlife. And if they say no, we're like, okay, that's fine. We won't put a camera here. But we spark up a conversation with them and try and hear their perspectives about the animals, because they know more than us. Like, we'll get some photos, but they probably see these animals move through the landscape pretty consistently. So we rely on them as well, essentially as informants, to tell us what's happening in these spaces.
Great, fantastic, Chris, or Dr. Schell, I'm sorry. Thanks so much, but unfortunately we need to wrap things up there. So thanks so much for taking time in your extremely busy schedule to come and talk to us today. And this has been extremely informative and stimulating for us all. And to me, your work really gets at the heart of what it means to do synthesis research. So I just wanted to say how much your time here today is appreciated. Thanks.
Absolutely.
And I just follow up by saying thank you too, Chris. I learned a lot, and it's your work, the breadth of your work is really phenomenal. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. This is quite a bit of fun. And if you want, you can always reach me either by email or otherwise. So I'll just put my email here in the chat. But it was a blast, y'all. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks again. Thanks so much.
Have a good holiday.